Okay, so let's start with our uppers or our toes. You've got your outer fabric pieces there that have been fused, and then you've got your fleece lining pieces. Lie them on top, right sides together like so, on both pieces. I'll just show you on one because then it's a bit clearer to see. We're going to do the same on both. So right sides together, and then you just want to clip or pin around that small curved edge at the top where your foot will eventually go. And we're going to sew round this curve, but we're going to start 1 centimetre in. So just going to use a straight stitch. We're going to sew round here, but we're going to start and finish 1 centimetre in from this top edge. So I'll just mark that with a ruler to remind myself. So I've got 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then I'm going to start and stop sewing 1 centimetre down. Move that clip out of the way just for a sec. So I've got a nice mark there. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to start here in fact, and I'm going to sew all the way around, and I'm going to stop there. It's really important that you don't sew all the way to the edge. And we're going to do the same on both, but I'll just show you with one of them. Oops, so straight stitch, and because I'm sewing with this wodgy, squodgy fabric and through quite a few layers, I want to just increase my stitch length to 3, just so that it doesn't the stitches are going to sink in, and small stitches will just kind of splurge into the fabric. Technical words. Splurge. Right, so 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm just going to do a few back stitches there, and then I'm just going to carefully and slowly follow that curve round. If you've got a speed dial on your machine, turn the speed level down, and normally to get round curves I'd say decrease the stitch length because it makes it easier. So I've increased the stitch length to 3 to accommodate the fact that it's quite a wodgy fabric, but if you find that too tricky to get round the curve, then you can take it back down a bit. Obviously the longer the stitch, the faster the sewing, the faster the machine pulls it through. I'm nearly coming back up to that pink mark. And back stitch at the end to secure the stitches. There we go. I'll trim off those thread tails. There we go, can you see? I've just stopped 1 centimetre in. Now once you've stitched around that curve, you just want to snip into it. So you don't want to cut your sewing at all, but what's going to make this much easier to turn round that curve is if you just cut some little triangular notches out of your fabric that will reduce the bulk of fabric at that curve, and it will make it turn through more easily. So you're just going to trim in there. Stubborn bit there. Oh. So trim away into that curve, making sure that you don't cut the stitches. Someone's laughing in the other room. That's good. They're watching some kind of You've Been Framed, I think. I'm just trimming all away. Just do another one in there. So you get the idea, you're kind of trimming those sort of notches. And you see it's clear if I put my hand behind. And that will help you turn your curve through. So repeat that with both of the uppers. So once you've trimmed it, you can just check to see if it turns through okay. If not, then trim a little bit further in, but just kind of turn it through and just check. And I think that curve looks pretty good. Quite happy that that looks nice. So do that with both of them, and then we're on to the next step. I'm going to want to refer to this chart here, which talks about the elastic lengths. I'm making a size 28. Okay, and I'm making the slippers, so I'm looking at number 4, back of the slipper. I need 16.2 centimetres for each slipper. So I'm going to start by cutting 16.2 centimetres of elastic, and I'm going to do 2 of those. 16.2 and another one. Then what we're going to do is take each of your heel pieces. So these are your rib fabrics. The ribs are running along this way. There's your chalk mark at the top and bottom. And it's going to fold here like this to make your heel. So I'm going to just attach the elastic here. And at that other point there. And I'm just going to do a few stitches just within the seam allowance at either side, just to attach that elastic. So it's going to end up sitting like this. I'm using black thread in my machine. You can't see the stitches on the outside of this, so I'm just going to use black throughout just to save me from having to change my thread over. And these stitches will all be hidden once the garment is finished. Let's have a look, move that so you can see. A few stitches forward and a few stitches back. And I'm just using straight stitches. All I'm doing is holding it in place. Just kind of holding it to that area. Same on the other side. Within the seam allowance. So it will look like that. My 2 heels are done. What I want to do now is fold them in half, wrong sides together. So I'm encasing that elastic, and I just want to match up the sides, the raw edges, put a couple of wonder clips in place, or pins if you're using pins. There you go, so that's nice and flat. Come around to the other side, draw the elastic through so that you get a nice flat edge there as well. So it's going to look something like that. Your elastic is along here. The elastic is shorter, it's drawing everything in. This is eventually going to be your heel, which will hug round, so the elastic is keeping your slipper on. What you're going to do now, oops, I've pulled that back through, is you're just going to sew all around the edge. So you're going to come in here, you're going to sew down here, along here, and then pull it back so that it's nice and flat, and sew along there. So your edges are nice and flat, but anyway, extra bit of fabric is sort of ruckled up in the middle. So you have to pull it along as you go, and we're going to do that on both of the heel pieces. So I'm using a zigzag stitch, a width of 3 by a length of 2, and I'm using a ballpoint needle. I'm just going to sew along the edge. These stitches will eventually be hidden out of sight, and so I don't need to worry too much about the fact that I'm using black thread on grey. All I'm really doing is just basting it all together. If your machine starts to stretch your fabric a little bit and make it wobble, just give it a little steamy press once you've done the basting, and that should bring it back to how it should be again. Hand wind into the corner there. Now when you come to this last bit, it's going to feel like it's pulling in, so just drag it back out again so that it's nice and flat. Where you're sewing, you want it to be flat, so you just pull the elastic so that you've got a nice flat edge there at the last bit. There we are. So, move that back. So there's your heel. So you can see I've just zigzagged all the way around the edge. It has gone a bit wobbly where it's stretched it through the machine a bit. So just give it a little steam if it does that, just to bring it back to how it should be. Cut off any threads as you go. And then you're going to do that on both heels so that you've got 2 panels that look like that. And that's the heel of your slipper. Okay, so you've done both of your toes and you've notched in, and you've done both of your heels. It's now time to attach them together. So what we're going to do is we're going to peel back. So looking at the toe, looking at the wrong sides of the fabric, we're going to peel back the fleecy lining, and we're just going to match these 2 edges together. So I've got my heel here, there's my elastic at the top, and I'm going to put that down here. So those 2 edges match. So this is why you left that centimetre, so that you could peel that back. I'm going to match those 2 up together, pop a couple of clips or pins to keep them in place, and you want this elastic bit to be at the top here, and then the zigzag where you put those together is at the bottom. So you put a couple of clippies in, and you're just going to sew with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Just make sure that's lining up well. You're going to sew with a 1 centimetre seam allowance along here. You want to avoid catching the lining. That lining is folded back, so you're just going to sort of start a centimetre in there and sew down, or you can start here and sew down a centimetre and just stop when you meet that fleece, because what's then going to happen is you're going to sort of sandwich it. Can you see? It will make sense in a minute. So yeah, you just want to peel back your lining, line that up, and then you're going to sew that with a centimetre seam allowance. So just a straight stitch between 2 and 3 stitch length. Just move that along a bit, that's better. Okay, so lining up my raw edges with the 10 line, or the 1 centimetre line on my needle plate. Back stitch to begin with, and then off I go. And I just want to avoid catching the lining. There you go, a few little back stitches at the end there. And then what you do is you put the lining back over the top so that it's sort of sandwiched in there. And you're going to sew that again. And then you're going to do the same on the other side. And you're going to repeat that same process with both of them. There we go. I'm just encouraging it under there a little bit because there's a few layers and it's a little bit reluctant to begin with. Back stitch at the end. So there you go, that rib is now encased, sandwiched in between the lining and the outer fabric. Turn it through to make sure that everything's looking okay, that there's no holes or anything like that, and that it's lining up okay and you're happy with it. If you're happy with it, then you can turn it back to the right sides, to the inside rather, and you can just trim off that little bit of extra there at the corner, which will just help it turn through nicely. There you go. We've got a nice neat turn there. And so at the moment, let's move all of this out of the way. This is how it will look. Oh, so you've got one side in there. So here's what you have. You've got your rib sandwiched in between your outer and your lining. And you now need to bring it across and do the same on the other side. So there it is, fold it across and bring it over, right sides together with your dotty lining. Peel back, in fact you can draw this, to make it easier, draw this back to the out of the way there. So you're gonna bring it round and line it up again, right sides together with your lining on the other side. Let's move this down a bit. So there we go. So I'm just clipping together the rib and the fused cotton, keeping the lining out of the way, the fleecy lining, and I'm just going to sew those together now with a centimetre seam allowance. Back stitch at the end there. Okay, so it looks like that now, and then what we do is we take our fleece lining and we put that over the top, so we're sandwiching everything together, and then you're going to sew it all together like that. Back stitch at the end. There you go. Let's see how that looks. So we trim off any little thread tails, and then just before we trim anything, just turn it out, and that looks pretty good. Happy with that. You can, in fact, at this stage, you can start to see the slipper come together. There's your elasticated heel, that's where your foot's going to go in there. So I just want, now that I'm happy that that's okay, I'm just going to turn that through and just trim off any excess bulk of fabric where we've got those few layers there in the corner. Careful not to cut through any of your stitches, but just sort of trim those seam allowances a little bit so that that points out nicely. Reduce any sort of uncomfortable bulkiness around the ankle area. There we are. So do that on both of the slippers. Obviously everything you're doing on this slipper you're then going to repeat exactly the same on the other one. So we're now ready to attach the sole.